Okay, let's talk a bit about muscle contractions, which literally means drawing together. So when your muscle contracts, all the muscle fibers generate tension and they try to shorten. So unless you stabilize one bone, say the proximal bone, uh, to allow the distal bone to rotate around the axis, both bones will try to meet each other. And so that's when we get into different concepts that we'll talk about in the next video. So the purpose of muscle contractions is to maintain a position, raise a segment or an object, or lower and control a segment or an object. So we have three types of contractions: isometric, concentric, and eccentric. Isometrics are when there's no movement at the joint and no change in joint angle. So iso means equal length, isometric. Iso means equal and metric is length. Muscle force and tension occur, but there's no change in length. And it occurs under two conditions. Either you have co-contraction, where your antagonist muscles are contracting with equal strength of your agonist, or a muscle is held against an external force. So similar to this picture where you are lifting a 10-pound weight, but you keep it at a joint angle at your elbow of 90 degrees, and the muscle is engaged and it is activated and contracting, but there's no motion. A concentric contraction is when the muscle force or tension, and we say force and tension because those are synonyms, and we'll probably move when we talk about torque into only force, but if you hear the term tension, you can kind of replace that with force. So when the muscle force or tension is sufficient to overcome an external force, that results in the shortening of a muscle. So when you're lifting a weight, so in the image at the right, there you're doing a bicep curl. So you're flexing at the elbow joint and you're lifting that 10-pound weight, the muscle is shortening. So features of concentric contractions: the muscle shortens. It's usually a contraction that opposes or is opposite of gravity or an external force. And the muscle torque, and we'll talk about torque, which is force times moment arm. That muscle torque, or the internal torque, overcomes the external torque. And concentric contractions typically are what we use to produce acceleration of body segments. So when you jump or when you throw, that acceleration phase is a concentric contraction. Eccentric contractions are kind of the opposite, that the muscle force or tension slows down gravitational or the external force, but it doesn't overcome it. This allows gravity uh, and the external force to lengthen the muscle, even though the muscle is resisting lengthening. So in the example on the right, it's like the down phase of your bicep curl. So you're lowering the weight, so you're extending your elbow, and the muscle is activated and trying to shorten, but the weight is overcoming it, so the muscle is active and lengthening, which is an eccentric contraction. So a few features: the muscle lengthens, it resists gravity or that external force. It's typically the braking mechanism to control movement or speed. So you can think about when you throw a ball, the acceleration phase is a concentric contraction, and then the as your arm is slowing down after you release the ball, then you're using an eccentric contraction to break that movement by decelerating those body segments. And the external torque overcomes the muscle torque for an eccentric contraction. Few other features of the eccentric contraction is that you are strongest when you're contracting eccentrically. It can produce the most force. So if you're in a gym and you're spotting somebody, you are spotting them on the concentric contraction because they're stronger eccentrically. Much more, or a lot of normal activity is eccentric contractions as we just ambulate around the world. And muscle injury and soreness are related to eccentric contractions. So, two examples of exercises. So, the way we're looking at this is from left to right. So, the first phase is going from, say, anatomical neutral, and then there's abduction of the glenohumeral joint, right? So, the motion of the glenohumeral joint is abduction. Now, if you're thinking about what gravity is trying to do to those weights, if you relax your muscles, those weights are going to try to pull you into adduction. So for the concentric phase, phase one, you're trying to overcome the effect of gravity on the weights. And the muscles you're using concentrically are the deltoid and the supraspinatus. Phase two of that exercise is you start in the abducted position and you're going down to adduction of the glenohumeral joint. That is in the same direction that gravity is trying to move that joint, adduction. So if they're the same, that type of contraction is an eccentric contraction. And you can think of it as you're controlling the lowering of those weights. Same muscles are activated, the deltoid and the supraspinatus. Second example. This is somebody rising from a chair and then sitting back down. So we're looking at the hip joint. So for phase one, the hip joint is extending as you stand up. The direction that gravity is trying to move that joint is flexion. So imagine as you're trying to lift yourself out of a chair, extend that hip. If you just relax, gravity will push you back down into the chair, flexing your hip. So if you're extending your hip as you rise and gravity is trying to move your hip joint into flexion, those are opposite. And so therefore it is a concentric contraction of the gluteus maximus and the hamstrings. So that's for phase one. Phase two is when you're lowering yourself back down into the chair. So you're flexing your hip joint. Gravity is also trying to flex the hip joint, but you are controlling that movement. So it's an eccentric contraction, again, of the gluteus maximus and the hamstring muscle group.